RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. If you're a builder of modern or contemporary furniture, chances are you've used the edge treatments known as the chamfer or the roundover. Now, I've done a lot of both of these things. I've done chamfers and roundovers on long straight edges. I've done it on end grain. I've done it on large pieces. I've done it on small pieces. I've done it on edges that are straight. I've done it on edges that have curves. And in all these cases, I didn't do it using a router table. This is in part because I don't own a router table, maybe someday, but also because I'm often doing these operations on smaller parts that aren't quite safe enough to do on a router table. I'm also often doing roundovers that are of variable radii, or chamfers that are variable width or variable angle, none of which are easy to do on a router table. Instead, I do them all by hand, and I employ multiple hand tool strategies to accomplish these ends, and I'm going to talk about those strategies in this video. The thing about hand tools, or woodworking in general, is that there are many different methods by which you can accomplish just about anything in woodworking. And so I brought you over to my hand tool cabinet because there are a lot of different tools in here that I will use to do chamfers and or roundovers depending upon the situation. One of them is the Stanley 113 compass plane. This is one of the only vintage planes that I own, and you'll see that it has a kind of a spring steel sole on it that I can adjust with this knob here. And you can see how that creates a curved sole right there. So for long sweeping chamfers, I very much prefer to use this as opposed to something that has a very short sole to it, like a spoke shave. I have flat bottom and round bottom spoke shaves up here. I will sometimes use those for a little bit smaller parts, smaller chamfers, but the round bottom spoke shave in particular I find a little bit of a pain to use compared to some of the other options that I have. I sometimes refer to that round bottom spoke shave as the Chattermatic 5000 because it's hard to get a smooth surface with that. It's a very technique intensive tool to get good results out of. But it is an option. Another option I have for chamfers is, if it's a really long straight edge, is just to use a bench plane. So I'll use my Clifton number 5, or I might use my Veritas block plane here. Another nice thing about this block plane is because it's a bevel up block plane, like a lot of them are, I have variable angle blades that I can put in here. So I can use a high angle blade, and if I have grain that's being a little bit ornery, kind of running in and out, I can get a little bit smoother results with that higher angle blade on that block plane. Another option I have is for smaller pieces is a smaller block plane. This is the Lee Nielsen Violin Maker's plane, and I really like doing small parts with this thing because it's very easy to manipulate with one hand. Another tool that's really simple that I particularly like for doing roundovers are these tools right here. These are the Veritas cornering tools, edge cornering tools. They're just little pieces of steel here that come in different cutouts or different radii, including this 1/16, 1/8 inch, 3/16, and 1/4 inch roundovers. The thing about these is they of course work better on straight edges and edges that have a little bit of a curve to them, but as long as it's not too tight of a curve, they will work. Another thing you have to be careful about with these in particular is when you have grain running in and out of your edge. If you encounter reversing grain with one of these tools, you will splinter the hell out of that corner. It's not a good situation, so you got to be careful with these. It's fraught with peril, these tools, but when you have straight grained wood to work with that's got a nice consistent run out on the corner, these are really nice to use for that operation. But that's not it. I have some other tools over there on the wall that I will also use for variable roundovers and chamfers. Now I'm over in the corner of my shop where I have some pegboard hanging on the wall, and my workbench is right here. This is the left end of my workbench. So this is within easy reach of me when I'm using this end of the bench over where my leg vise is. And these are my rasps and files, and I like to use these for all kinds of things. In particular, chamfers that are variable angle and variable width. I will also use these for roundovers that are variable radii, and I will use them for roundovers that are on end grain. And I'm going to demonstrate all of these in a minute. Just to go over what I have, these are all made by Tools for Working Wood. These are all hand-stitched rasps, except with the exception of this file here. And they're almost in the order that I use them most. So the first one I'll go to here is this 9.5 inch 11 TPI. So this is for doing rough work. The next one I'll tend to use is a size down from that. This one is a 6.5 inch 18 TPI. So that gives me a little smoother finish than this big coarse one does. So I have kind of a coarse, medium, and fine kind of operation going on here with this cabinet maker's file. This is also from Tools for Working Wood, but I had to put my own handle on it. And then I have some kind of specialty rasp. So I'm not really going to be using this video, but this one is a sawmaker's rasp. This is no teeth on one side, teeth on the other with kind of a roundover, and it's a 25 TPI. So when you're making saw totes and that kind of thing, these are super handy for that. This one here is a 25 TPI modeler's rasp, which I think is about 6 inch. Yeah, I think it's 6 inches, this one. That one's nice and little, and that's more for doing like little decorative details, as is the case with this last one. This one is a round rat tail rasp, which I believe is also 25 TPI and maybe about a 1/4 inch in diameter. But the main ones I use for the operations that we're going to be talking about today are the cabinet maker's file and this big coarse 9.5 inch rasp and this 6.5 inch 18 TPI rasp. And I'll usually follow the three of these up with a little bit of sandpaper for kind of a finish prep. So let's go to the bench, and I'm going to show you how I do a lot of these operations using the tools that I just showed you. All right, well, I'm going to start with some of the more simple operations first. So I'm going to show you a quick chamfer using a block plane. You'll notice that on this piece of wood here that I have grain running out in this direction towards this corner. I have the same thing going on the other side. So it's a good example to show, but especially for my cornering tools. So I'm going to show you that on those edges a little bit later. But I'm going to use this other edge to do a quick chamfer. And one thing I'd like to show you is for the block plane that I have in Veritas, we retract the blade a little bit so I don't ding it. You can actually remove this variable mouth shoe off the front of the plane and just drop that off of there like that. And they have an attachment that allows you to do a very consistent chamfer. So from the top here, I have a shim that sets the bottom of the plate out to where it matches the sole of the plane. So that's an even coplanar surface. And then I can adjust the width of my chamfer by these little flathead screws. And unfortunately, they're flathead, which I think are pretty much the worst kind of screw you can use unless you're doing like, period work or just on the fine furniture itself. But for things like this, I don't know why you'd use a flathead. That drives me nuts. But anyways, you can adjust the width of your chamfer with this. And when you use this in the plane, it basically replaces the shoe at the front right there. So I can tighten this down. I still have an adjustable mouth. And when I use it to do my chamfers, I can do a very even chamfer across the entire length of a very long piece. So if I'm doing the edge of like a tabletop or something where I'm doing a chamfer on an edge that's like 6 feet long, then I would probably use this tool for that. So I get a nice even chamfer over the full length of that table. And then if I put a high angle blade in there, it's less likely to encounter grain that's running the opposite direction and really make a mess of it. Yes, there'll be a small amount of tear out, but it's nothing that I can't fix later on with card scrapers or sandpaper or whatever. So that's kind of a neat little attachment that you can use on this block plane. But for the most part, when I'm doing a small part like this one, this isn't a 6 foot long tabletop. Get all the dirt out of there and the shavings. I'll just use the plain freehand. What that allows me to do is to do different angles of chamfers. When you're using this little attachment, this thing doesn't fit in here very easily. It is a tight fit. That's machined to very tight tolerances. So unlike when you're using that little chamfer attachment, when you're freehanding your chamfers, you can do angles of chamfers that aren't 45, of course. So you're not limited by an attachment like this or by a particular router bit that is 45 or 30 degrees. I can do literally any angle I want. And of course you can check your edge and make sure that you're not encountering tear out. If you are, then go the other way, flip your piece around and do it that way. So that's just a simple chamfer. And of course, if you want to do a tapered chamfer, Then you start at one end, take a short shaving, take a slightly longer, take a slightly longer, and work your way down the edge of the board until you get to the opposite end, and now you have a variable width chamfer, that is whatever angle I just made that. So that's chamfers on straight edges, pretty easy. Now I'm going to do a quick round over on this edge where I see that the grain is running out towards this corner here, so I know I'm not going to encounter reversing grain. And I'm going to do it with these cornering tools by Veritas. And just like if you were using a powered router where if you're taking a big chunk out of something, you'll go a little bit of depth with each pass until you reach your final depth. These cornering tools are set such that you'll do a round over, that's 1/16, then 1/8, then 3/16, and then 1/4. So you'll start with the 1/16 and just give it a push. And by the way, these come with the tools you need to sharpen this, and it's basically just a profiled block that you wrap very fine sandpaper around, and that's how you get these edges sharp. And you'll notice that with the shape of these, you can actually push or pull when you do your edges. So let's do the 1/8, actually pulling, like that. And I usually do several passes because if you change the angle that you're applying the tool with, you might miss out on some of the material that you need to remove. And then I'll come in here with a 3/16, like that. Go a little bit further depth. And whoops, the other end of that is the 1/4. Let's go all the way to a 1/4 in this case. I find in a lot of cases that 1/4 is a bit too much of a round over. It's like you're getting carried away. And you can see even in this case, I'm encountering grain that's running out the other way just a little bit, but it's not so bad that I'm making a mess. But what I can do is I can come back to these spots where it's running the other way a little bit and actually pull over those spots and smooth out that surface a little bit that way. And then when it's all said and done, my round over isn't going to be perfectly profiled from end to end the way it would be if it was machined, and that's okay. I'm doing it by hand, so it shouldn't look like it's machined. But if you want to soften that variability a little bit, it's good to go over it with, some sandpaper on a sanding block and just apply it on that round over until you get more of an even profile from end to end. And of course, if there's any little bits of tear out that are minor, you can kind of smooth those out and make them disappear that way. All right, here's another pretty easy one. This one is a tapered chamfer, variable angle on an outside curve like I have with this big offcut of cherry here. And the way I like to approach that is actually to use a flat bottom spoke shave. And with this, I can just kind of follow the curve. Now I want the fat end to be down here, the widest part of the chamfer. So you can see I'm working my way down and keeping an eye on the width of this chamfer as I go. See, right on the corner here, I'm not quite getting it, so I'm gonna focus on that a little bit more. And I'm gonna do it such that I have it sloped more this way at this end and sloped more this way at this end. With a flat bottom spoke shave, it's pretty easy to accomplish. And in days gone by, I would actually try to mark out these tapers by measuring and putting little pencil marks everywhere. More and more, because this is kind of a more organic form, it's okay if it's not absolutely perfect. You're doing it with hand tools. If I wanted it to look machined, then I'd probably just machine it, There's no shame in having something you did by hand look like something you did by hand. It's kind of the point. So you can see I'm starting flat here, turning it as I go, and just keeping my feet nice and far apart, so nice and stable, and applying more pressure as I reach the end of the cut. So there I have a nice variable angle, variable width chamfer from one end to the other on an outside curve. Now what about end grain? Say I want a chamfer that starts from nothing and widens to match this wide chamfer that we just did in the previous scene here. So the way I would do that in the past would be to actually use rasps and files. I find it much easier actually to use a block plane for this, and I'll just angle it off the end grain as well as skew the blade. So I'm not going straight across like this. I'm actually angling it at close to a 45, and then when I get to the end of the cut, to avoid blowing out that corner, I'll actually kind of push up off the corner so I'm not blowing out that grain there. So I'm gonna do that really quick so you can see that in action. And I'm actually not using a blade that I normally would in this case. I mentioned earlier that you can use multiple angle blades with this plane. The low angle blade would be better to be working this end grain with. It would slice a little bit more easily and perhaps leave a little bit smoother finish as well. So instead I'm using this high angle blade and just having to take a little bit of a lighter cut. Like that, almost there. And I just keep going until this corner and that corner meet. Right there. So I have variable angle tapered chamfers that meet at that corner there. All right, so now I'm going to do some inside curve chamfers. And this is just a scrap piece of walnut. You can see it's got a big knot with a huge occlusion in it, so it's not very useful for anything else. So I cut an inside curve on it with the bandsaw, smoothed it out on an oscillating spindle sander. And now I'm going to mark out some chamfers on this. And the way I like to mark out chamfers is to use this Incra T rule. It works with a 0.5 mechanical pencil. And I'll just use it like a panel gauge. Oh, and I put a shorter fence on it too. Normally it comes with a fence this long. But I had another older Imperial 3-inch Incra T rule that had this shorter fence on it. That's going to follow the curve a little bit better than this big long one does. So I'm going to do one side of my chamfer at about 3 millimeters or so. Put a little pencil line there. It's preferable to use pencil lines over marking gauge lines when you're marking out chamfers. Otherwise, when you actually hit your chamfer line, you're still going to have a marking gauge knife line in your workpiece, which isn't ideal. So that's about 3 mil down on that side. I think on this side I'm going to do something like, let's say 12. So kind of a 1x4 slope. I'm going to follow the curve around. Now this is a chamfer that you could do pretty easily with a router, except there probably isn't a router bit that does this angle. And so that's where you can kind of have a little bit of an advantage using hand tools over a router, is you can get whatever angle you want and not have to worry about ordering a custom chamfering router bit to do it. So, and for this operation, I'm going to use the Stanley number 13 compass plane. And again, this has a spring steel sole on it that you can use to adjust the curve on the bottom of the sole. And I'm going to adjust the compass plane such that there's just a little bit of rock. So there's a little bit more curve in the sole than there is in the workpiece. And that gives me the ability to ride right in front of the mouth of the plane to make this cut. And of course, walnut isn't really the best wood to demonstrate this on because it tends to be a pretty gnarly wood, because it tends to be a pretty gnarly tree and the grain is running every which way half the time. But for the sake of demonstration purposes, we're going to do it like this. And you can see on my bench here, I just have a couple planing stops. And that's usually adequate to hold it. Although sometimes you might want to put a hold fast in one corner where you're not going to hit it with the plane and work it that way. This is kind of tear outy, so I'm going to run this in the opposite direction here. Let's see if I can get a little bit more love that way. Yep. A little smoother, but it is wanting to lift. So I'm going to put a hold fast on this. See if I can hold a little bit better that way. Just like that. So I have one side against the planing stop because I'm going to be applying pressure a little bit this way. And then to keep it from sliding or rocking, I have a hold fast on that corner. And now I can keep an eye on those layout lines. Oh, now it's moving that way. I have to put a hold fast on the other corner apparently. Right on the edge there. You'll see that my hold fasts actually have a piece of rubber tubing over the ends of them that helps add a little bit of grip and shield the wood from getting marred as much by the hold fast. I'll often put little wooden squares underneath there to help even more with avoiding marring the work surface. And these are just pieces of bicycle tube that are from like cyclocross and hybrid bikes. They just stretch to fit right over that, cut a little section out and slide it on. And you can usually get tubes that are punctured or cut or whatever for free from your local bike shop. So if you want to give that a try, that's how you do that. And I'm hitting a little knot here, go figure. But now that I'm not using as much of a curve at this end, I'm going to flatten out the sole of the plane. Now it'll give me a little more control at this end. Yeah, I'm hitting the hold fast right there with the plane. So this is not so easy with this workpiece, but normally I do this on much larger legs. So that hold fast was in the way, so now I have a Veritas Wonder Pup holding this against my planing stop, so when I get to this corner, it doesn't cause this end to kind of flop out. So now I'm going to come back and see. Yeah, there we go. Now I can hit this a little bit more unencumbered and take nice light cuts. And again, I'm adjusting the sole of the plane so that it's just a little bit more curved than the curve I'm working, so I can ride the part of the sole that's right in front of the mouth of the plane. And that allows me to hit whatever part of the workpiece that I need to. And we'll just over here a little bit more. There you have it. It's pretty damn good right there. So to continue our table leg theme here, we have our inside curve that we did a kind of custom angled chamfer on with the compass plane. And say this is the top of the leg and it's going to be like it's going to have like a floating top. So this end grain is going to be exposed, and I wanted to do some sort of edge treatment around here. What I like to do there is typically a small roundover. And the easiest way that I know to do that is with rasps and files. So I'm going to come in here and put a 45-degree chamfer around this edge with my big coarse rasp, like that. And I'm just going to watch how wide my chamfer is as I go along to make sure that it's even from end to end. And one nice thing about that, as opposed to using something like a block plane, is I don't have to worry about blowing out that corner if I'm using a rasp. Now that I've established a little bit of a chamfer, I can come back and knock down the irises or the corners of these chamfers. So I'm going to do a milder chamfer that isn't as wide across the front. Same thing across the top. Now it's already starting to look like a roundover, but there's definitely facets there. And of course these are pretty coarse teeth, so it's leaving a lot of marks there, a lot of tooth marks. So now I'm going to move to a slightly less coarse rasp, some a little finer toothed. And now I'm going to come over here and knock the remaining irises off. I can squat down low and stretch my legs to the front. I'm getting a little bit better there. The tooth marks are a little bit less because I used a little bit finer rasp. Now I'm going to follow it up with cabinet maker's file. And that's going to be quite a bit smoother. It's going to remove a lot of those tooth marks. That's getting to be really smooth already. Now if you want, you could just go from this rasp surface straight to finishing, and it leaves a little bit of a hand-done touch to it. If you want to have this finish a little bit more with the same sheen of the wood on either side of it, then you might want to go over it with some sandpaper and then just curve the sandpaper to match the profile, finishing with the grain. That way it'll absorb the finish more evenly, because with your cabinet maker's rasp, after you've gone over it with that, it's so fine that it tends to almost like burnish the wood. And so it'll absorb finish a little bit differently than the wood on either side of it. That might be distracting. So I do tend to go over these roundovers with a little bit of sandpaper after establishing them with rasps and files. And if this was an actual leg that I was making, then I would go around all four corners there, and I have a nice round over on the top of my table leg. Now you can do larger roundovers on end grain using rasps files as well. I used to actually take a little like a stencil that had circles in it and draw the curve that I wanted to get on there, if it was going to be like a quarter circle. More and more I just do this by hand, because I've had so much practice at it. I can get a nice quarter round by eye almost as easily. So same deal, I'm going to start with my biggest, most coarse rasp first, smooth that out a little bit with the next one, and then smooth it out more with the cabinet maker's file. And I'm going to be pretty aggressive starting this out. You can see I have my workpiece at an angle on my leg vise here. And the reason for that is after I've established this initial chamfer on the edge here, I'm going to come in and knock down the irises of that chamfer, just like this. And that allows me to kind of access both sides. And if the vise chop gets in the way of the handle, I can come in at a little bit of an angle and kind of file it that way. And that allows me to work around any obstructions that might be in the vicinity, because I'm working on a smaller workpiece. There I've established some chamfers on either side of my main chamfer. I'll show you a picture of that. Now that that chamfer has 3 facets to it, I can come over that with the second file down and knock off those additional corners. So I've gone from a 45-degree chamfer to one that has 3 facets to it to one that has 5 facets to it, basically. And once I'm happy that those are all relatively even, I can go ahead and round over the entire corner. I can look at it from the edge here and see that I need to take a little bit more off of this corner here. I guess it's not a corner anymore, but the curve is a little tighter across here than it was the rest of the way, to have a nice quarter circle. I'm focusing more on that part of it. So a bit of a harsh transition from flat to curving. So I'll knock that down. Because this rasp is a little finer than the other, I can be a little bit more aggressive with it and not worry about overdoing something and accidentally taking too much in one pass. So on the one hand, it'll slow things down a bit, but on the other, you're less likely to screw up, and that will slow you down more than anything, is screwing up. That's starting to look pretty good. Now I'll come in with my cabinet maker's file. Not bad, not bad. All right, so I'm back and I have this piece of scrap wood that I took to the bandsaw, which has a very wide blade on it right now, and forced it to cut as tight of a curve as it would allow, so it actually burnt the wood a little bit there. And what I'm going to demonstrate here is a tapered width chamfer from this corner to this corner, and you'll see that the grain is running into the curve from here and from here, so I'm going to have to switch directions when I reach the middle of this. But with something like rasps and files, you don't have to worry about grain direction quite as much. So I'm going to go in here with the curved side of my coarse rasp. Just be really aggressive. If the curve is a little bit wider and you're off to the end of it, you might find it's actually easier to get a a straighter chamfer on the end of that corner by using the flat side of it, even though it's a curved surface. As long as I'm not going this direction and digging this corner of the rasp into the curve. I can control how aggressive I am by either going straight across the corner or doing it at a little bit of an angle. I like to do these longer, broader strokes to get a little bit more of an even taper in the chamfer as I go. Normally, I would set this off 90 degrees off the far corner of my workbench when I do this, so it's much easier to reach both sides of this opening. But because I have camera here and my workbench is kind of near the corner of my shop, there's really not enough room for all of it. So this is a little awkward here where I'm leaning over it and pulling the rasp toward myself a little bit. But now sometimes people will admonish each other about the way they hold on to their rasps. They might put a little piece of cloth over the tip of the rasp because they feel like the teeth are sharp enough they might cut themselves. I don't know if they're thin-skinned or what, but my rasps have never really been a problem to hold on to in the corner. Yeah, it's not super comfortable, but I've never cut myself on a rasp holding it this way. And it's always easier to control the tool by holding onto the tip. Another thing people warn you about is the oils on your skin will kind of corrode the metal on the end. I don't really see any evidence of that despite it being used for years and years on these rasps. And you don't really use these teeth to cut much of anything anyways right here at the tip. So that's not something I've ever worried about. There we go. Let's move to a less coarse rasp. I'll try to finesse this curve a little bit. You can kind of eyeball down the curve here to make sure it's nice and even. Paying a little bit more attention to grain direction is kind of running this way right here. So I'm kind of rasping with the grain a little bit more. And do the same thing coming from the other direction. Starting to materialize and look pretty good. Oops, wrong one. I'll go to the cabinet maker's file. Now this is fine-toothed enough that I can move across this curve even with the flat side. I find I have a little bit more control that way, and the corners aren't so sharp that they're going to dig in. So yes, you can use a flat surfaced file or rasp on an inside curve and actually get pretty good results that way. Here we go. So there is a tapered chamfer around an inside corner right there. All right, so last one. Now I'm going to do a tapered variable radius roundover around an inside corner. So I took that workpiece, I did the chamfer on the other side and just flipped it over. And now I'm going to do a roundover. And that's basically the same, or starts the same at least, as doing your tapered chamfer, except you're going to add facets to that chamfer as you move along and eventually round them over. So there I have a little bit of a tapered chamfer. And say that 5 times fast when you're drinking. And now I'm going to knock down those corners of that chamfer with a little bit finer rasp. You can see how I change direction depending upon which way the grain is running into there. And I'm going to knock over those corners and start rounding them over. Thankfully it's just cherry and it's not too picky about which direction I do any of this. Just beside the fact that I'm using a rasp and a file to begin with and that they're not too picky themselves about which direction the grain is going. That's pretty good right there. Now, with this example, and of course the examples that came before this where I didn't finish them off with sandpaper, you'll want to finish them off with sandpaper because You'll have some variability, of course, because you're doing this by hand. You can soften that variability to some extent by coming over this with some sandpaper that's nice and flexible. And I find that rather than using, you know, custom shaped backers and stuff like that, that you wrap your sandpaper around, that it's easier to just do this by hand so you can feel the surfaces that you're dressing with the sandpaper. You can often feel through the sandpaper where the problem areas are, where the high points are, and address them that way. And of course, you're keeping a close eye on what you're doing and stopping to check with a close look to see how you're coming along as well. By the way, I'll often do these edge treatments before I do any finish prep of the adjacent surfaces, because while I'm doing this, I might accidentally ding these adjacent surfaces, whether it be the way I'm clamping it, or that I accidentally ding it with a tool, or accidentally scuff across the grain with a coarse piece of sandpaper, and I'll have to remove that. Rather than have to go back and address that, I just wait until after I've done these edge treatments and then do my surface prep of the adjoining surfaces. There it is. A nice tapered, curved roundover done by hand. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that if the edge treatments you're applying, like is the case with this little roundover right here, if they're small enough and they're hard to reach, you can do that roundover entirely with sandpaper. That's what I did in this case. So these two roundovers here, which you can see they're tapering, that's a fat one, kind of a medium one, and then a kind of a small roundover. I did these two here with the edging tools actually, because it's pretty easy to read the grain here. The grain's running straight across. And then I softened them and kind of finessed them with sandpaper. But this one up here, this little guy, I did that entirely with sandpaper. And I started with like 220 to do it, or maybe 180 and then 220 and 320 to finish. And that's how I got this kind of stepped, graduated size roundovers on what is going to be a chest lift for the Borgonia dust that I'm working on. So that's it. That's how you can apply roundovers and chamfers to workpieces using hand tools by multiple different methods. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it on the end grain of a piece, if you're following a curve, if the chamfer you're trying to make is variable in width, or is tapered, or is variable in angle, or if the roundover you're doing varies in radii, you can do it using hand tools. And none of these techniques is really revolutionary in and of itself, but when applied in a judicious manner to a furniture design in concert with each other, they can really add up to a big statement. So I hope you got something out of this, and we'll see you next time. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.